And it begins, cry out with joy to God, all the earth. Oh, sing to the glory of his name. Render him glorious praise and say to God, how awesome are your deeds. And I've sort of talked about this before, but in Native American culture, it's the custom not to ask God for things. That when you, we're taught in our prayers with God to model them on the prayers, the conversations you have with people, because a prayer to God is a conversation with God. And if every time you talk to me, I'm going to ask you for something, you will stop talking to me. And so this is not the way we want to enter the relationship with God. But there are ways to ask without asking. And one of the things, like for instance, with regards to rain, one of the things is to praise God for how the world changes with rain, how beautiful the world is, how many poppies we have when you send the rain upon, how many that, and to make it a thing of praise. But this idea to be able to always come before God in a spirit of joy, to somehow find, this joy as we come before God. And he says that all the earth should do this. And the earth of its own sings to the glory of God's name and renders him praise. In the hierarchy of things in the world, we believe there's a linkage. And one of the things that Paul says in one of his letters is that when we broke our linkage with God, all of nature was separated from God. And that's why we believe oftentimes nature is dangerous for us, or nature is not benevolent to us, is because nature has been separated from God. According to the Jewish idea that's embodied in the scriptures, that every time we have like if we have a God and the people here, there has to be a link that stands between God and the person. And that linkage is basically a priest, okay? And what you want to do is to have everything in the linkage perform its proper job. And so with the fall of Adam and Eve, which incidentally used nature symbolically in the apple, so that nature has broken its link with God. What is the job of nature? The job of nature is to praise God by the way nature is. So an apple tree praises God by blooming and producing apples, A dandelion praises God by somehow, in the beauty of the small flower and stuff like that. I could tell you about my grandfather who used to make dandelion wine, but we won't go there. The idea is that there's everything in nature renders its praise to God. We do it verbally, but plants do it, in growing. But in order for the plant to glorify God by what they're doing, it has to pass through the lip. We are the people who verbalize that. So I look at the sunset and I say, that is a beautiful sunset that God has granted us. Well, that sunset has praised God. If we have a sunset and no one sees that, it hasn't. It has passed. And if you go into someone like Paul talks about all of creation awaiting salvation. And for Paul's idea, if you have a rose bush in your yard and it blooms, let's say every year, and no one ever turns to God and praises God for that, that rose bush will not be in eternity. But if someone looks at a flower and praises God, that flower is as redeemed by us as we have been by Jesus Christ. We carry this innate ability to redeem nature. by the way we walk the face of the earth and how we do it. Because just as Jesus relinked me with the Father, I have the ability to relink nature with God. It works through this. And that's why, again, at baptism, if you remember, a child is anointed prophet, priest, and king. We are the priests of nature, all of us. We are the priesthood of nature because we link nature to God. And we say to the Lord, how awesome are your deeds? And when, again, I think we have to be very careful that we do not confine our praise of God to the extraordinary of his deeds, but the ordinary, the sunsets and stuff. That to the degree you and I can actually attach praise of God to the ordinary things, that you and I will praise God more. Okay, I remember a woman who was in the hospital, incidentally, not for COVID, which is kind of what she was getting at. But when I went to the hospital, she was hooked up to IVs and stuff like this. And I said, it's what you normally say, how are you? But I've learned you don't say that in a hospital, Sometimes they have x-rays handy and stuff, but anyway, I said, how are you? And she says, everyone in the world that can breathe today rejoices in God. I was thinking, I never thought to thank him for breathing, but actually there are many people today who cannot, and they're alive, but they cannot breathe. Okay? But to learn, the more we can recognize God in the ordinary, the happier we'll be, because there's more than to praise God for. Because of the greatness of your strength, your enemies fawn upon you. Before you, the entire earth shall bow down, shall sing to you, shall sing to your name. And the enemies of God, of course, stand before God in terror. The real problem is the enemies of God who don't realize there is a God, the ones who, don't know about this. But the true enemies of God, I would see as, Satan and this sort of thing. And one of the things that Thomas Aquinas writes, he does a commentary on scripture at one point, and I think it's a passage in Paul where Paul says the demons look upon God and cringe in fear. And Thomas Aquinas says it's because they know he's there. And lots of people on the face of the earth don't know he's there. Okay, they just don't know what it is. It's like I saw several interviews probably about a month ago with people who were in the hospital on ventilators, and they were talking to members of their family who were visiting, I think, outside behind the glass and stuff like this. So they were talking to the people who were visiting, and the thing that they were most saying, because none of them were vaccinated, the thing that they wished they had gotten vaccinated. And I oftentimes think of that like with the pandemic. Some people act as though it isn't there, and that doesn't protect them, okay? And the same thing in the reference to God. If I live as though he isn't there, that will not protect me, okay? Because he actually is there. He says, come see the works of God. Awesome, his deeds among the children of people. And this awesomeness of God among people, I think, is a matter of, I hope you notice that what we're getting at in a lot of these Psalms is it's a theocentric way of thinking. So that when you look at the sunset, you thank God. But now he's talking about awesome, his deeds among the children of people. Several years ago, I had an opportunity with a priest friend of mine to go to Paris. And I don't know about other people. To me, the most beautiful museum in Paris was the d'Orsay, much more than the Louvre. I don't know why. Maybe it's because most of the art is more recent, more statuary anyway. But that you find yourself looking at a statue and just imagining what went on in a person's mind to, first of all, think of such a pose that so showed off a body as beautiful. You know, you're looking at it, you realize no human body I've ever seen looks that good. So, I mean, and part of that's the pose, you know, the way they put the bodies, because the bodies aren't unnatural, but the way they put the bodies and the ability to carve it and to be able to enjoy that, and at the same time recognize that's a gift from God. That's a gift from God. And the theology, as we carry it in the church, the theology of giftedness is that everyone is gifted. And I think it's sort of a curious thing that if you would take, let me just take some famous artist and put it hypothetically, you know, I imagine a doctor going to Florence and seeing the David and being awestruck at the gift that God placed in Michelangelo. But Michelangelo, if he got sick, would be awestruck at the gift that God placed in the doctor. And to understand that when you and I are seeing anything like that at all, there is a gift of that equality somewhere in me. It's somewhere in everyone, you know? And we have, I think in our society, maybe in our society, gifts are valuable to the degree they generate money. And so we tend not to see certain gifts as valuable. I remember when I was very involved with the charismatic renewal in most of my pastoring years. But I remember at one of the parishes I was at, it was really interesting. There was a woman in the parish that if you could get her on a committee, all the meetings ended peacefully. And I don't know how many of you have ever been at parish meetings. They make a civil war look like a background game, okay? So, I mean, you really have to, but somehow she had a knack in the way she listened of making everyone feel heard. And they say the big problem when a decision goes against you in a large group, the real problem most people have is that they haven't really heard me. If they really heard me, they wouldn't be doing what they're doing, okay? But she had a knack for making everyone feel heard. And at the end, people were at peace with the decisions. And it wasn't as though she ever brought forth any great idea that anyone backed or anything like this, but she just had this knack. And so you reached a point, you realize if we're having a meeting, I'm not coming if she isn't there. Okay, it's that simple. We'll assign her to the meeting, but don't phone me till you know she's there, okay? But that, I mean, that was an absolutely marvelous gift. I don't think anyone would put that on a list of gifts. I'll tell you, I went home thankful every meeting, you know, that she was there. But we need to recognize that within each one of us, whether we ever discover the gift at all is not the issue. The issue is to know that you carry a gift of catastrophic importance, as everyone who walks the face of the earth does. And if you and I live lives in harmony with God, those gifts do their job, whether you recognize it or not. And this great power. I oftentimes use the example of Charles de Foucauld. Charles de Foucauld was sent away to the Foreign Legion because his family was a very powerful family, the Defaucons in France. They were descended from the royalty. So they're a very powerful family. And he was, I guess, to keep this on a G rating, he was embarrassing to his family. And so they got him into the Foreign Legion. That's what you do with Frenchmen, okay? Put him in the Foreign Legion. And while he was in the Foreign Legion, he developed a fascination with map making and would draw things. And I'll tell you, his maps were used universally. They were even used in the Second World War. His maps of Morocco were used until they started taking photographs from planes. Until then, his maps were used. He was very good at it. But in the process, he fell in love with Morocco. And Morocco, as you know, is a Muslim country. He felt a great call from God to establish an order whose job it would be to teach Catholicism in Morocco. And so first thing he started before his order, though, he joined a group of monks in Morocco. I don't know if you ever saw that movie about those Trappist monks that were murdered. He joined that community and left that community long before the thing took place. And then he got going and decided he was going to establish this community. I'd like you to know that while he was there in Morocco, he traveled with one of the tribes. That's what he wanted to do. And at that time, as a Roman Catholic priest, you were not allowed to say Mass unless there was at least one other Catholic present. So he went through great periods of his life when he couldn't even say Mass. And he worked and he wrote a rule so that this group of people could go into Morocco. And if you've never noticed, rules for Catholic orders are written presuming they're in a Catholic country. All the rules for orders are written that way, not his. His is a rule written for a non-Catholic, for a Catholic community in a non-Catholic environment. During his lifetime, he never made one convert. No one ever volunteered to join his order, and he died thinking his life was a waste. Since his time, every single order in the Catholic Church ever established has used his rule as the basis, because everywhere in the world is a non-Catholic environment today. So any order that's established today uses his rule. Now, he probably thought his great gift was making maps, or that his gift would be making converts, but his gift was to prepare the entire church for the next century. That was his gift. Now, he never saw any of it in his lifetime, but that was a catastrophic gift, and only he had it. Only he had it. And we have to trust that's true in all our lives, whether we see it or not. There is some amazing gift. And to the degree I try and serve God, I will use that gift, and the church will remember it because they're very important to the church. I'm sure he thought no one would ever know his name again. He'll probably be canonized next year. I know his name's on the list. We'll be lucky to make the list. Anyway, he says, come and see the works of God, awesome his deeds among children of men. He turned the sea into dry land. They passed through it on foot. Now, of course, he's calling back the Exodus and the parting of the Reed Sea and how they got out of Egypt. He says, let our joy then be in him. He rules forever by his might. And this idea of God ruling forever, he says, remind yourself of what God does, not just what he's done. And that's the idea that, you know, that in our services, our events, our history, we recall what God does through individuals. I think it's important. Today we celebrate the feast of Maximilian Kolbe. And Maximilian Kolbe, you know, we honor him as a martyr for the faith and everything. But you know, if Maximilian Kolbe had never been martyred, he'd been canonized. He had the largest Catholic newspaper we have ever seen in history. He started a a group dedicated to Mary called the Immaculatas, that were a lay group that was all over the world. I mean, he did all these amazing things, and martyrdom was just, sort of the end of it. But he did all these amazing things. And to understand kind of what God's doing at every time and place. I don't know if I told you, I probably did, but when I went to Poland years ago, I had mentioned my spiritual director had been in Budapest and said they were afraid of dying without the Kaddish. So he gave each student a copy of the Kaddish and told each one of us to stay at each Saturday for some Jew who had died with no one to say it for them. So we've done it over the years. But anyway, when we went to Auschwitz, you go through Auschwitz and they take you on kind of a tour. They want to propagandize you. And I don't mean that negatively. They want you to know what you're looking at and see. So, but as soon as you get out, they don't leave you on your own there. They take you to Birkenau. And Birkenau, I'd never even heard of it, is a camp right beside Auschwitz. It's twice the size of Auschwitz. And it was built because they couldn't kill people fast enough in Auschwitz. Okay, so this was built right beside. So we go through Birkenau, and then the bus is there ready to take us to the hotel. And my friend knew I wanted to say the prayer. So I'm about ready to get on the bus, he pulls me by the arm and points to a cab in the parking lot. And he had phoned for a cab. And so we got in the cab and we went over back to Auschwitz. Now, they don't like you wandering around there alone, that you're supposed to be part of one of these tours and everything. So we went down the one side and we went over there's a whole bunch of the barracks that were just for priests. Originally, this is a great thing. Originally, they assigned priests and ministers just indiscriminately. They didn't want them to think they were special or anything. But priests and ministers that were in houses, the houses tended to calm down and be happier. You didn't have all these fights breaking out. So they took all the priests and ministers out. But the area was just for Catholic priests that I'm talking about. So we went over there, and the only thing that remains in those is the foundations. So we went on the foundation, we said the prayer, there's no one around. We went on the next foundation, said the prayer. We went through the entire camp, the ovens, even the cell where Maximilian Kolbe died, went through every place. And after we'd gone through about 5 of these buildings, my friend looked at me, he says, I think God wants us to do this. So we did it in every single building in all of Auschwitz. And there are thousands of tours going through. We just never happened to hit one of them where we were going. It's amazing. But this idea of being able to realize that God rules over everything, period, and learn to recognize that when you're going in the hospital with a problem, God's in charge. Your doctor works for him, God's in charge. The medical people are helping you. They work for God. Anything you go through in your life, always remind yourself that God's in charge. You go to school, God's in charge of your education. You get married, God's in charge of your marriage. That this whole idea that we stand before God, who is in charge of everything. And so it doesn't really matter, and we get the impression, like you watch this in Jesus's life, where his miracles work incrementally, like a leper is trying to get through to Jesus, and the apostles and everyone are trying to keep him away. He's really good at fevers. We don't know about leprosy yet, and the only thing God hasn't done is what he hasn't been asked to do, and to understand he's actually in charge of everything. His eyes keep watch on the nations. Let the rebels not exalt themselves. Okay, so God keeps watches on all the nations, and let the rebels not exalt themselves does not refer to rebellious nations, refers to people who rebel against God. I need never exalt myself, because no matter where I am, God's above me. God is above everything. It says, O peoples, bless our God. Let the voice of his praise resound, of the God who gave life to our souls and kept our feet from stumbling. Okay, so notice how this begins again. Always watch for this, the plural. He says, "O peoples." So he's talking about everyone in the world. He says, "O peoples, praise our God." That, I use the example because of the dog, but if you have a dog, it is very difficult to figure out who owns whom, okay? Very difficult. And it's something to understand. That is exactly the relationship you have with God. That when Satan looks at you, he cannot figure out whether God owns you or you own God, because that's the relationship he has with you. We say, all these people, go ahead and praise our God. You're welcome to praise him, but he is always and forever our God. The relationship that really matters. It says, of course, the last thing in that is that kept our feet from stumbling. He does less of that as you get older, but the idea is that to realize what God may have spared us in human life that we don't know about. He says, "For you, O God, have tested us. You have tried us as silver is tried. You led us, God, into the snare, and you laid a heavy burden on our backs." And the idea he's talking about praising our God, this relationship that exists between God and myself is not a relationship that precludes punishment, but it precludes destruction. And that's something to know about. God puts things in our lives that for our education, to build compassion in ourselves. I've found in my life the really serious problems that I've gone through, and there've just been a few of them, but in a very serious problem I've gone through, I have later in my life always met at least one person in the same situation who felt hopeless, and I could tell him exactly what to do. The things in the church, because people just don't have an understanding about how church rules work and everything. When I was in Salinas, I was a member of a religious order. I mentioned leaving the order, and the order would not let me go try and get in another place, and they wouldn't allow me to function. So a priest here in the diocese, a Monsignor at Sacred Heart, phoned me at the house I was at I was in San Diego at the time. And he said, "Are the other priests in the house?" And I said, "No." And he said, "How long will they be gone?" I said, "About 3 days," because each of us would go out to do parish missions. And he said, "I'll have a car there in 3 hours." So a car came by, picked me up, my luggage, and took me to Sacred Heart in Salinas. He sat me down in his office. He says, "As a member of a religious order," he says, "if they order you under obedience to come back, you have to do it. But they have to be able to prove they ordered you." So he said, "You are not to answer the door, and you will not open any registered letter." He says, "We will open them and decide whether or not you see them." And then every week, he used to have lunch with the bishop. So he took me to lunch once a week with the bishop, so the bishop got to know me. And then the bishop wrote to the religious order asking if I could stay. And of course, I stayed. But 20 years later, I'm pastor of the mission, and a priest who had AIDS came to the mission and asked if he could help out. And then I said yes, and he was helping out. And his religious order was calling him back. Again, they did not want him out, and people know he had AIDS and a member of that order. So they were going to lock him up in a hospital or something. But anyway, they're going to call him back. And I came into his room, he was crying. I told him, I asked why, and he told me. I said, I know how to solve this. He says, you never answer the door and we open registered letters. Be at peace. That was the end of it. But I've learned in my life when I have something serious like that going on, that has nothing to do with me. God's preparing me to be ready for someone else with it. So I've learned that. It took a couple times, but I know that now when things go on. But when things go on in our lives, they're for us, they're for the people around us, but nothing that happens to you in the presence of God is other than for your good. No matter how it looks like it's gone, no matter how it looks, the relationship you have with God doesn't allow it. Okay? So the relationship that we have with God, there's something that he's doing. It could be to make us better. It could be to enable us to help someone else. But to understand that the crazy, the awful things that we see ultimately are for the good of someone somewhere. He said, you let people ride over our heads. We went through fire and through water, but then you brought us to a place of plenty. It's the idea that what we're about is never to perish, okay? We are not involved in anything will perish. Ultimately, we are brought to the place of plenty. He said, burnt offering I bring to your house, and to you I will pay my vows. Now remember, we've seen that pay my vows before and the other thing, and remember the promises we've made to God. The vows which my lips have uttered, which my mouth declared in my distress. And I wonder at times, like I look at, I look at certain people historically. I'll give you the example of Martin Luther. I don't know if you know the life of Martin Luther, but as a young man, he was in a really terrible storm. And he took refuge under a tree, which is not the smartest thing to do in a lightning storm. But anyway, there he was. So he was under the tree and he prayed to Saint Anne. And he said, if you spare my life, I will become a priest. And so he became a priest. And we know what ultimately happened to him and all this sort of thing. But if Martin Luther could have sort of bit the bullet with regards to the church, everything that he was about, we would have had in the church right after his death. Because he didn't just bite the bullet. We got it at Vatican II. Okay, but the idea of the English receiving from the cup, this was all the stuff Luther was about, but it was so shocking at the time. But I look at that, I think the terrible storm was because of the changes God wanted to bring in the church. And he scared Luther into a promise he kept. And then in the church, he could see those things, and then he began to work to change them. And ultimately, it all turned out for our good. It actually turned out for the good of Luther in his own life too. I think it could have been done easier, but that's not the issue. The issue is that the event appeared very terrible, all this sort of stuff, and ended up serving the church in great power. You know, there are even people arguing today for his canonization. I had a Lutheran minister come up to me less than a week ago. He said, if Francis had been Pope, we'd all be Catholics still. It's true. He said, I will offer you burnt offerings of fatlings with the smoke of sacrificial lambs. I will offer bullocks and goats. Now, when they go through this, rams, bullocks, goats, for us, it's a list of animals. And I can't explain this exactly to you now because I don't know what it is, but I want you to know that each of these animals refers to different kinds of sacrifice. Sacrifice of petition, sacrifice of the birth of a child, sacrifice of thanksgiving. But by listing the things, he's talking about the variety of good things God does, and that they're accompanied by different sacrifices. Come and listen, everyone who fears God. I will tell you what he did for my soul. And this idea that we have to be people who announce the good things of God. One of the things that most amazes me in the scriptures and the world around us is that we often give the bad news before the good news. And that's one of the things that the American bishops, the idea of refusing communion to someone who is not in the state of grace, whether it's a politician or someone in an invalid marriage or something like that. And the answer to the Pope was very clear to them. What the Pope said was, communion is not the reward of a good life. It is the food of sinners, okay? The reward of a good life is heaven, but communion is the food of sinners. And you and I need to make sure people hear the good news. And we do that by sharing what God has done in our life. You know, I remember a routine, I think, that was done, trying to think of which comedian it was. But anyway, one of the comedians was doing a routine, and he was talking about the crossing of the Red Sea and how wonderful and everything it was. And he ended the routine by saying, but what's he done lately? You know, that's why we're here. You and I are supposed to announce to the world what he's done lately. And this idea about God being active. I think at times of the business where, what was it? The woman came to Jesus, the woman who was caught in adultery, and they brought her to Jesus and everything. You notice in the whole thing, Jesus will forgive her adultery and tell her to change her life. But you notice he does something first. Before he ever goes into any of that, he makes sure she knows she isn't going to be killed. That's what she's concerned about. Am I going to be killed? So we go through that thing of the writing in the sand and all, but what he does, he gets rid of any possibility of her being stoned. Then we can talk about what she's supposed to do. She knows she's going to live. So she would have heard nothing while she's sitting there. You know, well, I want you to live a good life. What difference does that make? I'm about to be stoned to death, you know? I've got 4 minutes of good life left. You know, this is it. But this idea of being able, we want to make sure people hear the good news. That was the big thing of Paul. Make sure people know they're saved. Then try and get them to be good. Try and get them to celebrate salvation received. Try not to get people to earn salvation, okay? That's amazing how many of us grew up with this earning salvation thing. But the fact of the matter is, salvation comes as a gift, and God will allow no one to earn it because he loves to give it as a gift, you know? So no one can earn it. No matter what a person were to do, it comes as a gift. Once knowing the gift, you and I should spend our lives trying to thank God for the gift we've received, but not earning it. We've got it, you know. He says, to him I cry aloud with exultation ready on my tongue. Had I considered evil in my heart, the Lord would not have listened, okay? And what he means is not that the Lord wouldn't listen to him, but the Lord does not listen to the plans of evil. So if I'm planning evil, God's not there. If I'm planning good, God is always about that. God's always involved in it one way or another. Charles de Foucault, he planned to do something great and wonderful, so God did. It's just not the great and wonderful he thought God was doing, but God did the great and wonderful through him. Does that through anyone who plans good. It becomes great and wonderful because God listens and works. But truly God has listened. He's heeded the voice of my prayer. Blessed be God who did not reject my prayer, nor withhold from me his merciful love. And I'd remind you again, that phrase, merciful love, it is the most important, it's a single word, hesed, but it is the most important word that appears anywhere in the Bible. That this love by which God is enslaved, it's what he has chosen to do with regards to us. O God, be gracious and bless us. This is Psalm 67. O God, be gracious and bless us. Let your face shed its light upon us. This light of God's face has to do with the way God looks at people. When I think of this verse, what I think of, if you've ever gone to meet someone on a plane, you don't get to do that anymore, do we? We have to wait in the lobby. But back when you could go down and watch people, you could watch people off the plane and see the face of anyone who saw who was to pick them up. It just immediately, their face, and that's what, you know, when I come before God for judgment and he sees me in line, I want to see him excited, happy, and delighted I finally died, okay? That he's there for me. And that's what we want. We want the shining light of God's face. I don't want him, oh, you again, okay? So will your ways be known upon earth, and all nations learn of your salvation. And again, notice what we do in these blessings that we show of what God said. We show God's ways, and God's ways on earth are ways of gifts. God's ways on earth are not ways of earning, okay? Now, if God has given you a gift in art, it's up to you to develop it. But the gift is there. And I think you know that there are many of us that no matter how much we work at it, we'll never have it. It is same thing with music. If you have a voice, it's up to you to develop it. But the voice is the gift. And to understand that our God is a God who walks the earth giving gifts. No one needs to earn it or anyone. We need to find our gifts within and develop them. We were born gifted. Everyone is born gifted. And in the ancient things that we were taught in grade school, I don't know whether you got this, because a lot of times they used to tend to use very practical things, I guess largely because we were children. But what we were told was that the fallen angels had left places in heaven, like empty mansions. And so God would create people until there were enough saved to occupy the places of the fallen angels, okay? I much prefer what's developed by St. Augustine. St. Augustine said that God is infinite, and no person can completely express who God is. But each one of us, by the differences of our lives, I think you know lots of people who lead lives that are very, very similar. You'll never find two people who lead a life that's the same. It just doesn't exist. But according to the intricacies of your life, the blessings, the problems, this sort of thing, you will know something about God that no one who has ever lived before or after you can know, because they haven't had exactly that life. And that everyone who wants to know that about God in heaven has got to come to you. And if you want to know certain other things about God, you'll have to talk to the other people in heaven. That this whole thing, that there's the treasure you ultimately carry by the intricacy of the intricacy of your life, if I might use the example, the intricacy of your life is preparing a setting. But the stone that goes in that is what you know of God that no one else does. And you will carry that into heaven. And anyone who wants to know that has got to come to you. It is uniquely and powerfully yours and is the reason you were created. The very reason we were created. You know, we look at pluses and minuses and stuff in our creation. I've often talked about this, that when I was going through school, I considered the greatest minus I had was the dyslexia, because as a result of the dyslexia, I couldn't read. As the result of dyslexia, I can't understand anything of any complexity unless I can render it simple, you know? And that's why I'm hopeless with math. I don't know if you've ever thought about math. Most people don't think this way, but there are 3 buildings, 3 cakes, 3 donuts. 3 is a nothing. There is no 3, okay? There has to be 3 something. So that's why math is beyond me. You know, it's about nothing. You know, I just don't get it. But so the dyslexia crippled the reading and this sort of thing. So once I was ordained a priest, the real problem I found that as a priest, I had to preach relatively simple homilies, and they had to be short because I couldn't use notes. I found out it wasn't a curse at all. But I didn't know that till after I got out of the seminary, okay? And the fact of the matter is, I think when you come before God, some people will recognize that at different gifts you have while you're alive. Many people won't recognize it till you come before God in eternity. But even the negative things are to this gift that you carry, to this gift. And so we make him known on earth so that all nations may learn of his salvation. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. Let the nations be glad and shout for joy. With uprightness, you rule the peoples. You guide the nations of the earth. This uprightness about God's rule being upright, one of the great problems for the Jewish people historically is how often they've been persecuted and have been the underdogs. As a result, when we think of God, we normally think of receiving mercy. Jews don't. All they want from God is justice. They just want this equality. And it's through their fascination of justice that we eventually came to the knowledge of everlasting life. Because if you believe that God is absolutely just, and for the Jews, that's his primary thing, you realize, the book of Job being the best example, you realize that justice does not take place on the face of the earth. There are many good people who do not enjoy the results of their life, and many evil people who seem to get away with everything. There has to be everlasting life for God to be just. And for the Jews, he has to be just to be God. Okay, simple equation. We'll pick it up here at verse 6 after the next break. Thank you very much.